One thing I will say before we begin.
Yeah! Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for not leaving me alone even though you didn't know I was here.
As much as possible.
All right,
Yes.
and I believe we are live too, so take it away, Mr. Barn.
Fantastic. Good evening. Welcome to all the panelists. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the audience for coming. This afternoon, the purpose is to discuss the first of the prescribed titles for May 2024. And that is the following question. Is subjectivity overly celebrated in the arts, but unfairly condemned in history? Discuss with reference to the arts and history. As always, we can find lots of different things to discuss and to get into with this question, and our aim in this panel will be to get you guys to try and give different perspectives. I will ask questions and give the opportunity for all of you to have a say about the different questions, and if at any point you just want to pass, if I ask you something and you don't have anything to say, that's fine. Other people will jump in and give their opinion, so to pass on any question if you find it tricky or nothing comes to mind. So I wanted to actually start with you, Mr. Henrik, if that's okay. The first big word here we have in the PT is subjectivity, and it's something that philosophers kind of define and talk about a lot, and it comes up in TOK. So how do you like to explain the concept of subjectivity?
Sure. I think when we think about subjectivity, it is always paired with objectivity, so we can't ignore the other side, I guess, of the coin here. The notion then is that we're dividing ways of talking and thinking about the world into two distinct types. One that is sort of, depending on your standard, either agreed upon in a social setting or is more truthful or accurate in describing the sort of empirical reality that we exist in. And the other is more description or an experience that is individual or more open to interpretation. This is normally, as we see here, sort of separated by the types of knowledge, though I think in this discussion we're going to be breaking it down and seeing whether there are more gray areas or whether this dichotomy at all is as useful as we think it is.
Very good. So would anyone else like to comment on what they understand by subjectivity?
Personal influence.
Something where you have more personal influence on the truth or the kind of knowledge you have about something?
Yeah.
I have a question for us all. Do we think of ourselves as subjective beings?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes. So, I mean, to kind of push things immediately into this area, I think that naturally we're going to want to focus on history, but I want to think about objectivity in arts. What would that even look like? What does that mean? I think answering that will hopefully clarify the second part a little bit more.
Yeah.
So, like, what at one of our arts faculty here, what would objectivity look like in the arts? So we have spaces for objectivity in the arts.
So not to throw too much of a wrench into the conversation, throw it. I would contest that, except in very limited ways, there is no objectivity in the arts. I would say in some limited ways, so if you want to talk about A440 tuning in music, that is measurable by science. Okay, so that's measurable. If you want to measure adagio versus prestissimo, you have a metronome, that's measurable. That can be objectively decided upon. But because arts are inherently related to both a reflection of and a challenge to the culture, the history, the environment in which it lives, it is inherently subjective, in my opinion.
Good.
I agree. But what about in terms of visual arts? I think that objectivity would be adopted in forms of like naturalism or realism techniques.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely, as Mr. Hendricks said, if you have a culture and you have an established norm and you're talking about photography and you're deciding if a photo is successful in terms of its use of the rule of thirds, for example, right? That's fairly measurable. You can kind of say, okay, the foreground was effective here, so that's subjective. But you can look at the picture and kind of measure it out. Is it following the rules? But then you can also say, okay, that's a tool, but is that in fact the art itself? Or is that a tool with which to create art?
And I think this gets us perfectly into the sort of IB ideas and methods and tools, right? So what you're kind of pointing to is that there are tools of art that are potentially objective, right? So I can measure, we do photography, right? I can measure how much silver is in an individual frame of a typical type of roll. I can measure how much light is being absorbed. You know, I can look at the framing. And in many ways, this is what AI technology that tries to replicate art does. It measures all the quote-unquote objective things. And in a way, it also, this is where I think it's more complicated, objectifies subjective things, right? It takes, let's say, we're looking to create a beautiful depiction of a natural scene. What an AI program would do, it would have human respond and say, this is objectively beautiful, this is objectively not, go through this over and over again until it would have that standard be the standard by which it would generate a beautiful scene. And so, to
Then
clarify,
you have to define beautiful.
well, and so that's the I think the tricky thing here that we get into is that as a method and tool, I mean, even in our own instruction, right? As an art teacher, you have certain methods and standards that you set. You don't claim them to be objective in some sort of deep Platonic universal sense. But if someone comes in and they're pitchy, you're gonna say, hey, all right, we have an objective standard for now. Right?
Yeah,
maybe in some
for
future.
sure. For sure, in music there is an objective standard around, and I'm gonna clarify, in Western music, there's a standard around, is this in tune? That's measurable. It's measurable, and especially now with the tools we have, that's measurable. Our ears are accustomed to Western tonal music for the most part, and that is measurable. Not every culture values tuning in music. So we value tuning in Western music because that is the water we swim in. That's what we are hearing from birth, that's what we're used to. But there are many cultures in which being out of tune is considered beautiful. So it comes down to the definition of which culture decides what reality is real, right? So in our culture, in Western culture, we typically think in-tune music is pretty. We can measure that tuning by frequencies, scientifically. But you know, I was just listening to this, it jumps into another topic, but I was just listening to this idea of culture in terms of gardening, right? There's an art to gardening. There's the English garden, which is purposely designed to look like it's purposely not designed, right? It's purposely designed to look like it's natural, but it's designed.
Yeah.
But a French garden would be designed to be very symmetrical. And depending on if you grew up in a French culture or an English culture, which of those is beautiful, and which of those is too organized, or which of those is too much of a mess, and that is completely subjective. We can measure its success according to the cultural rules, but defining what is beautiful is, or what is art, is more tricky, because you have to then define what is the culture from which you're making that definition. Yeah?
I want to go back just a touch, just to try to clarify a little bit about what we mean by subjectivity. So far, we've brought in some ideas about beauty, which is related to value. We've talked about things that might be more individual, and Mr. Henrik mentioned the idea of us living subjectively, of having our own internal world that we're imposing outwards. One example I like to talk about is if you look at maybe this table in front of us, that you're looking at it from one perspective and you're looking at it from another, and the idea of objectivity is something that goes to some degree beyond the perspectives that we have individually. Those might be individual, or they might be cultural or national. You hinted, I think, that you've said that you don't think objectivity exists in the arts. And I would wonder if it's something that really exists at all. If it really is a viewpoint that comes from no particular viewpoint, that almost doesn't make sense. So we have an idea that there's a real table beyond us looking at it, but philosophers have argued that that's quite a difficult concept to understand. But things like science or the historical method attempt to put together lots of different perspectives and try and find something that goes at least beyond my own view, something that people can agree on is seen as more objective, even if it still comes from a certain perspective. So I thought it might be good just to go back a little bit and focus on that idea of certain perspectives. When you're looking at and learning about art or producing art, to what extent do you think that you should be trying to just portray your own perspective, or should you be trying to go beyond that?
So I mostly produce films, which is like a form of visual media, and to some extent we can interpret, we have like a desired outcome of how we would want our viewers to respond to the film that we're making. And there's a lot of different things that go into making a film, but one of the ways that we can alter the way that the audience receives our film is through like color theory, sound, the angles that we film at. Even the storyline tends to be something that we're inspired by, as opposed to something that is our own. There are people like who make documentary films, and they make films that are just like for others, but some people also make films that are just documenting their own lives. And personally, I prefer capturing stories of others because I think it's more interesting. But in visual arts, it's kind of hard to say like that I only make films for myself, because I don't. I also make it for others and how others perceive it. If I want to make a film that is sad for others, then I will make it like sad. Like, I don't know how to explain this, but for example, we use colors that are darker, like blue and gray, or we put background music that tends to be a bit more melancholy and solemn. So I guess films, in a sense, can be subjective, but your subjectiveness is actually orchestrated by the filmmaker to make it seem like you're the one who's interpreting a certain way, but it's kind of like the other way around.
That's really interesting, and it seems like from what you're saying, and putting that together with what Mrs. Bill said earlier, there is different levels of subjectivity. On the one hand, the idea that middle C has a specific frequency is very, very objective, but the idea that it is middle C, that it's the middle of something, is a very culturally relative thing. And what you're saying, it sounds like, is that on the one hand you want to reach beyond yourself so that you can communicate to others, but you still want to do it in a way that is reflecting
your own like ability.
So I have a term I want to introduce here: sneaky objectivity. And here's the reason why. The whole notion of being able to communicate with others means a shared language, which means there needs to be, at least in terms of norms, some objective, again, quote unquote norms, right? Now, I think it's important what you brought up earlier, that we distinguish, at least in the arts for now, I'm not focused or caring too much about the notion of sort of objectivity in this empirical, science-based sense. While it is useful for notes, I think the more interesting thing is this: well, are there sort of objective norms of what's acceptable in a culture? Are there objective norms of, if I want to communicate sad as a visual artist, blue, for some reason, has this connotation in this society, in this culture, right? The whole notion of communication, it means that you're not going to go and just start filming random colors and you're trying to express yourself. You go, oh, well, I know everyone accepts this as the standard of communication, but I'm going to throw it out the window. Now, some artists do that, and maybe that expands the language in the same way that poets create words. But I think that in the arts, we can focus on this sort of objectivity of communication, objectivity of the norms of how we express ourselves. I think that is going to be quite different than the sort of objectivity we get into with history. right?
I think another useful term I like the idea of sneaky objectivity. A term we often use is convention for something where there's an agreement on certain things, like the idea that blue represents sadness. There's nothing objective about it, but it's not just an individual idea. So it gets beyond a certain level of this is just my idea, just something that people can share in and say, okay, that's a convention. We can all understand that.
But I think the reason why I want to use the term objectivity is objectivity, at least in a day-to-day sense, and maybe we've taken it a little bit out of the philosophical into the real life. Objectivity for me means that it's concrete in this way that you can't just decide that it's not real. Right? Like that's the beauty of subjectivity, is I can look at something and go, I know everyone sees it this way, but I don't. I think that the sneaky objectivity gets to these norms like money. I can't just walk in and put $20 down and go, yeah, this is 100. Right? Like there's this weight, this socially determined normative weight that you run into. Now you can, as an artist, like I said, reject that entirely, but you're going to be pushing against these sort of norms that are more solid than something like just pure subjectivity.
Yeah, and if you were to say to your theatre teacher or music teacher, this play was brilliant to me, it should be given a brilliant grade, the subjectivity is going to run up against, again, a kind of established rubric, and a rubric is an attempt to objectify a little bit things that are a little bit subjective, to make it more objective, something that we know is partially subjective.
I think also, like, and when it comes to art, it also depends on who's making the art. For example, if you were to look at Banksy and all these other like street graffiti artists, they produce art in the streets, and it's like unknown, unseen, until someone puts like a big name on it, like Banksy, and then suddenly that art is going for millions overnight. So in a sense, it's saying that whilst art can be anything, when it comes to like famous artists, it makes that art more valuable than other art.
Yeah.
And so I guess also like the person that it's coming from, like the artist in itself, is kind of like a standard.
I like that idea. Money, in some sense, is a way of quantifying the value of something, but is it the real value compared to how people value it in their appreciation? I'm not sure that's the best way to value art. Let's move on a little bit, because we have talked a little bit about subjectivity and we've started in exploring the idea of art. I wanted to complicate the issue slightly, just because art is a very unusual area of knowledge. And I think it's important that we think not just about the artists producing it here, but we've started to get into the idea of how much audiences appreciate art, what they're willing to pay for it, how people who are teachers, for example, appreciate the art of a student. So we have the subjectivity of the producer, but also of people who are making judgments, either as audiences and so on. But there's a third aspect, which is performance. When somebody is a performer, they may add their own subjectivity to something that's been created or produced by someone else, and it's reproduced in a slightly different way. So art creates a lot of complexity when we're thinking about subjectivity. It's not just one knower, whereas if we're thinking about history, normally we're thinking about the knowledge of the sources and the knowledge of the historians. In art, there's all sorts of knowledge that's different forms of knowers that can be talked about. I wondered if anyone has any examples of art that they think where subjectivity is celebrated in particular. What art examples come to mind?
Okay, I actually, I have like a photo of it. So
Okay.
I bought like this exhibit where it was like an installation, and it's basically just like an empty room, but with fancy lights, and it caused a lot of, at the time when it was released, it caused like a lot of controversy, because many people were wondering whether a piece like that can just be considered art. And this artist who made this is kind of like known for making art that's not like, it's very abstract, you know. So it causes the visitors who actually visit the room it's the whole point is for them to kind of like think about the empty space and going into like, by manipulating the light in the gallery, how do the visitors think about the room itself? And it's like, it's bringing us, like that he says, bringing a space that is usually a backdrop to other artworks into the center stage. But like, in my opinion, I don't think that it should be as valued as it is being valued now in comparison to other arts, because I think when it comes to artists, they put in a lot of heavy work and a lot of hard, like a lot of time into it, but then and then you see other artists who are not doing as much but are being celebrated as much as these other artists. It makes their work less like devalued in a sense. I don't know how to explain that.
I think, I have the feeling that the question, if it's provoking anything by talking about being overly celebrated, it's probably pointing towards those kinds of modern art, especially ones like that where they give you an open room, or I think of 4 minutes 33 seconds.
I just pulled that up. John Cage.
Yeah.
Do you know what that, you want to explain what that is?
Well, it's a famous piece of music where the music is the silence. Yeah, we looked at that last year in TOK.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
So, a lot of things happen in terms of, again, the cultural exchange around art. So artists are, you know, there's a great book by, and actually might be great for whoever's taking this essay, is David Eagleman is a neuroscientist who wrote this book, Runaway Species. And he essentially works, and it's terrible, I forgot the second author, but he's a composer and a musician. And they did a real exploration of the intersection of neurology and creativity in the human species, and how the creativity itself is kind of the driver of human innovation. And he talks a lot around art. And he talks about one of the things is that in any era, in any culture, you have expectations around art, shared language, like you said, the sneaky objectivity. But you also have the sort of repetition suppression that happens in the brain, where the more times we see something, the less we see it. And so art that is always feeding into the cultural expectations eventually is boring, and people don't care about it anymore. So artists are always working in the intersection of balancing expectation and how much they can violate the audience or the recipient of the art's expectations in order to provoke something new, in order to provoke innovation. And there's no scientific understanding of where the tipping point is too far. But John Cage got up and sat down at the piano and sat in dead silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Yeah. And that piece has done a lot. Yeah. And many people request it from Dr. Bill for their performance piece, for their IB music. Yeah. But yeah, is it music? I don't know. No. You know, that I don't know. But I had a thought around that. But so say I was just listening to another the same book actually, Runaway Species, and Beethoven at one point wrote a string quartet, and the last movement of the string quartet, he was completely deaf at the time. I think he called it Fugato Grosso, I think. And it was 17 minutes long. It was 3 times longer than any last movement of a string quartet ever. But it was very innovative and different and long and challenging. But he refused to go to the place where it was being performed because he was afraid. So he sat across the street in a bar, and his friend came and told him how successful it was. Well, they liked everything except for the Fugato Grosso. And he had to rewrite the final movement because it went too far in violating the cultural expectations of what a string quartet was in the early Romantic late Classical period. And that is kind of in every case. Like, we go to see something, and if it is for our cultural expectation too dissonant or too strange or too different, or like the Rite of Spring, where there were riots at the opening of the Rite of Spring for many reasons, political and cultural and artistic. 1913, I think. Okay. Be wrong, don't quote me, but there were riots at a ballet with the Rite of Spring, and there's contention that some of it was political, but that some of it was that Nijinsky, I think it was Nijinsky, right?
Stravinsky.
Stravinsky's a composer, but about the choreographer, Nijinsky's choreography was too strange for people, and that they reacted by rioting in the theater. There's also some political story to it as well. But so what is too far, and what then is avant-garde? Rite of Spring, nobody riots at the Rite of Spring when you go see today. What is avant-garde in 1913 is boring and passé in 2023, maybe. Not boring, but you know, it's culturally accepted and doesn't challenge us. So you all the way back to, is it art in 1913? Is it art now?
Well, let me ask Annika, how did you feel when you saw, I presume that was the first time you'd seen that performance when we watched it in class. What were your things? Did it feel avant-garde to you? Did it feel fresh?
The
4 minutes,
30
30
seconds. I was just waiting for it to start. In the beginning, I really didn't know what I was expecting, and then it only went into like the first minute or minute and a half that I realized like, okay, this is the point of the show.
Yeah.
But I really do consider it music to some extent, because it was the audience, it was the setting that he was in that made the people in the audience, like their reaction, their sounds. Because as I remember, like some people started laughing afterwards. That was I think that was his purpose. That was the goal, to hear everybody there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it seemed a bit off, it seemed a bit strange, but interpreting it now, I think it was a genius piece, truly. Because it was something it was never seen before, so I always think that the difference, instead of doing something that's similar to other artists, John Cage did something different, and no matter the interpretation, it's what makes us remember it now, because it was the only one that ever happened.
I want to explore one more thing related to the arts before we move on to history. You mentioned earlier the idea of realism, and dear, as you were talking about making films, you talked about making films for other people. I think as soon as you are telling someone else's story, there is a feeling that there should be some accuracy, that there's a truth that needs to be conveyed. So if I am writing what happened in class, I can write a fictional story, but it feels like as soon as I go into talking about other people, there's a truth that is there that ought to be told. If I write what happened in class and it's complete fiction, but I blend it in with what really happened, there might be characters in there, and essentially I start telling lies, if you see what I mean. If I write that Annika did this, and it's a character in my book, I'm starting to create something that I'm not being accurate. In that sense, my subjectivity is coming up against a feeling of some duty I have to convey some truth. One thing is just talking about yourself. Like, say, if you just make films for yourself, then you don't really have that duty. You can do more or less whatever you want. But as soon as you want someone else to watch or observe something, because what we write about reflects the world to some degree, or our perspective of the world, but still we are talking about a world. Isn't there some duty to either capture something about the world or make it better? There are a lot of artists who seem to feel that we have some purpose or duty when it comes to art. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's just a wonderful transition topic to get into history, because I think you're at the sort of space where they blend and merge at points, right? If your task is to tell what happened in an artistic sense, how is that different than what your task is if you're a historian? Certainly the notion of ethical obligation has been one in my own life. I've mentioned you before, I haven't toyed around for a very long time with the idea of writing a novel based on my time growing up in Santa Cruz and the different lives that I observed, and I really would love to tell the story of my close friends and their family. I can tell those characters with more reality and detail in a way that gets at some aspect of the human experience in a much better way than if I created characters, I think. And yet, I cannot bring myself to do it. I can't. If I put a piece of paper down, I feel gross. I feel like I'm disrespecting the other person. They don't get a say in the matter, right? And I go, well, this person's neurotic, you know, this person's relationship with their father is the reason they behave this way, right? Now, of course, I wouldn't say that. I would describe it and show, right? You know, here's the activities, I'll let the reader make up their mind, but I'm seeing it through my own lens. And I would feel this deep sense of unfairness. I, as the author, am the last word on this event. I witnessed, they saw it, and they never got a chance to, you know, contradict me. And I think that must be exacerbated way more when it comes to filming, right? Because in a way, every time that you film something, the choice of lens, the choice of color grading, or whether you have color at all, the choice of perspective, all of this makes a scene feel very different, even though it presents an objectivity. Like, this is what actually happened. What do you think about that? Sorry, I should know it.
It may be problematic, but I feel like when it comes to art, art has no moral, like no artist has like a moral, ethical obligation to produce something for the sake of their expected audience response. I completely disagree with it because I think that limits the pursuit of self-expression. And I think any artist it also, how can we assess subjectivity by how the audience responds? Because isn't the whole point of creating art, it isn't based on what others think about it, it's meant to be an individual kind of action, I think, personally. And when it comes to filmmaking, I make films not for other people, but for myself and as my own self-expression. And yes, I think that it's bad to lie when you're obviously, like, that's not the right thing to do, but at the same time, storytelling in itself is also a form of art. And if your audience makes some sort of conclusion or draws conclusion from what you've made, then that's like up to them, but you don't really have some obligation to tell the truth. I think it's based on entertainment purpose.
Exactly. No, I feel like if artists spends too much time seeking objectivity, seeking for the truth, it just limits them, if not demolishes their ability to perform art at its purest form. I feel like we see that a lot often in music. Like, think pop culture. There are many artists these days that are singing about this person and that person, and that's the truth to them. But how the fans respond, how, just like Dia said, it's not, they don't do it for the response, they do it for their production, for their...
Let's get into history. So when we were talking about the area of knowledge of history, the question asks us if it's unfairly condemned, if subjectivity unfairly condemned in history. So I suppose the first question is, where do we see subjectivity in history?
So to throw another wrench, I also don't believe there is much objectivity in history. I'm not a big believer in objectivity.
Yeah.
I guess that's coming across, but
Okay.
yeah.
But I agree, because when I talked about this, I closely linked subjectivity to like bias. Because especially like historical knowledge is based on evident proof of what happened. And bias, when speaking of bias, I feel it has a negative connotation behind it. So as learners, if we ever make an assumption or anything about history, it appears biased, that we are throwing a favor. However, if we observe subjectivity through a historian lens, their interpretation of that turns into like an argumentative approach, like a more reliable approach. And like you said, I don't believe in objectivity too, because deeply where our historical knowledge is rooted from, it is from a subjective viewpoint. It is from stories that were told over time by someone who could be biased.
So I think we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful in making our distinctions. I think what we're talking about right now is sort of historical narratives, and we want to maybe think if we want to separate that from historical objects, right? So if I have a letter that I'm able to verify was sent from somebody famous, to say Benjamin Franklin to Thomas Jefferson, right? Do we want to make a distinction between sort of the objectiveness, quote unquote, of the letter and the subjectivity of the narrative that we then tell off of that letter?
Yeah, I think there's value in just defining what is history, because history could be a list of dates and facts and things that we can verify. But that teaches us something, but it doesn't. I mean, what makes history usable? What's the purpose of history? Like, why do we care? It's over. So, if we're trying to define history as something that is the story of us, like, who are we? Why are we? Where are we? How did we get here? What's our purpose? How do we use the past to inform the present and the future? Then history has a whole other sort of value and color to it. So I think it's important just to even think about what is history. What are we learning and what are we teaching when we talk about history? Because I think, you know, as Dio was saying, it's another way of storytelling. I mean, in a way, I would say it's another art form, history.
I guess where I want to maybe push is thinking about something like this, the argument that's been ongoing about whether Hitler was a vegetarian or not, right? Now, in a way, its import historically is in the narrative forming, right? Like how people take it. But the historical disagreement is something that's much more, I guess, quote, in this objective document-based way, right? Do we have any documented evidence that shows a tendency? Do we have any incidences of recorded of him consuming meat, right? Now, those individual moments are then strung together to form narratives, but I think it's important for us to deal with whether that can be objective, right? Like that sort of the bottom floor grunt work of history that historians do, can that be objective? And if so, then where, I guess, the subjectivity is in how we arrange it or what we choose to highlight.
Yeah, definitely. And then are you then defining history? There are people who also define history as only since the beginning of writing, right? Like, so some people only define history as existing from Mesopotamia, where we have cuneiform and things are written down. Before that, prehistory, right? But that's not how I think about history. I think about, like, what can we sort of document all the way back is still, to me, history. So maybe I'm wrong, but there are definitely historians that say the beginning of history is 6,000 years ago, and there's no history before that, because that's not history.
And if indigenous groups don't have writing, then they would be left out of history.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. Just to explore prehistory for a moment is an area that interests me a lot. The idea that natural scientists are, which isn't part of the topic here, but just to make a comparison, telling a story about the Big Bang and evolution. It has a narrative structure to it because it has a beginning and an end. It may not have artistic qualities per se, but they are telling a story, and one that maybe could be seen to compete with other stories. For example, you mentioned indigenous. There may be creation stories from different parts of the world that have their own version of that. So whilst we can't go back to beyond writing and still call it history, we still have stories about what happened before, and we still create competing narratives that may turn to science or to other things to support them. I would like to go more into the idea of sources. Let's pick up on the example of the letter to Jefferson or whoever it is, or to Franklin. Isn't there subjectivity in the very people who are observing the events in the first place? So even if we say something is a primary source, that doesn't mean we've got beyond subjectivity. How do we get beyond that? Is there any way that we can use sources? Isn't the historical method an attempt to try to be more objective and less subjective?
I think it's like, in history we tend to follow the majority rule. So if I mean, that's true, an individual person's account can be very subjective, but I think that we can find like a pattern. If a group of people are seeing one thing, then it's likelier to be the truth. But then again, we also have to think about whether these group of people have different kind of beliefs, their own beliefs, or like, if they're on what, when it comes to like things like wars, are they on one side or the other? But I think in this situation, with the letter, if there was like a group of people that could verify that that letter was from that person to that person.
Could this be the same mistake that people make with natural sciences, about the notion of natural sciences looking for something to be proven versus increasing the feeling like we have an accurate story, that is one that can be overturned at any point, that we're accumulating evidence to increase our sort of probability of whether this event occurred as described, that
It's not settled.
Yes,
open
it's
to
perpetually
further-
unsettled, right? Like a good historian wouldn't say, oh, we can't change the birth date of a historical figure, right? They'd say, well, right now we have 15 separate pieces of evidence and contemporaneous accounts from all these people. You got this one piece of paper. Where the hell is it from? Did you write it? Who are you? Why do you smell so strange, right? Like, but one thing I wanted to, sorry if this is a little hijacky, but I really want to, it came to my mind, it's relevant. Based on the telling that we're saying of these narratives, will we think of historians as practicing a form of art?
I do. Clearly, that's my point of view.
I think so too.
Do you think history is kind of art?
I don't, but.
Tell us why.
No,
Go.
truly, but that's the thing, I haven't said much of it because I truly don't, but I'm trying to find evidence to back myself up.
Can I make a proposal? I mean, the question suggests to us that it's asking if it's unfairly condemned in history, but it's suggesting to us that it is condemned, right? It's not completely there, and is it true that it is unfairly condemned in history? I would ask, is it condemned in history? I think generally it would be. Maybe less so today. Most of the time when you're teaching the historical method, you're trying to get students and other people to get beyond their own perspectives and to try to find the truth. Whilst no probably modern historian would claim that it's as simple as that there is the truth. I think there is behind all attempts to do history a kind of attempt to be as objective as possible.
Absolutely, but so that is why these days there are different types of historians we can go looking into. So for example, the most traditional one, Orthodox historians, they tend to give the objective narrative of the dispute if we're talking about a war, for example. And then there are revisionist historians that revise and question the objective truth and bring in like other factors into it, that such as like public opinions, language, what they put on the media, etc. So I think it is very open to interpretation these days, and yeah, and I do believe that it's only like post, if we think academic history curriculum, we talk about these past events that has happened, and most of what I've gotten from that is that it is only post that event, we begin to view a contemporary interpretation. For example, post Cold War era, that's when it started to allow scholars to collaborate and examine different sides to conclude into a new interpretation. Because back in the days, we only thought it was okay, USA and Soviet Union, and afterwards we realized that it affected other parts of the world too. It was like it had like a global implication on it. Korea, Vietnam, China, whatever. So.
The stories are diversifying.
Yeah.
Can I do a metaphor here? Maybe we should think about it. I mean, this is a very TOK thing. I mean, the production and then the consumption of this type of knowledge. So maybe we can go with this metaphor. The day-to-day historians are like farmers in the field, right? And their just job is trying to get these raw crops, right? The vegetables, the milk, whatever, vegan, so try it. But yeah, no milk, just oat milk. They're getting the oat to make oat milk, right? And so then they take that, and then that's like the undergraduate historian, that is the hobbyist, that's the person who's going to find these like discrete units. Then it's taken, and then you have this sort of second running historians with, and this I think gets into power as well, historians who have more power or are trying to upset the order, who take those ingredients and then create these different dishes with them, right? And so you may have some sort of radical historians who are turning the things into foam. Look at my cool foamy history. And then there's more traditional historians who go, well, I hate this foamy, it's food-wise, it gotta be foamy. But then at the end of all that, you still have the food that needs to be fed in the lunch cafeterias in school, right? And that in many ways would be sort of the nationally formed official quote-unquote narrative, right? The food that we decide is most palatable, that is more, maybe not as avant-garde, and that could change over time by that sort of second rung. But that is a place where, I mean, you brought this up, the notion of an educator. If an educator comes in and says, well, you know, the U.S. says that the Second World War ended in what, 1945 in the U.S. by U.S. standards, but it was actually 1950. They all got it wrong, right? We probably want to say, hey, no, those other guys can do that up there in the academic spaces, but you need to tell the sort of
The main
quote unquote objective story, right? You got to give the straight ahead nutrition. You can't be giving them the foamy food, right? Like if that becomes the norm, if that becomes accepted, you can do that, but you have much more constraints, right? Mr. Giordano can't just decide to go, well, you've heard about the Revolutionary War. It's not real.
Yeah. What you're suggesting is that there's a kind of more accepted, processed truth that is fed to schools, and then there's the kind of questioning goes on only in the universities or a higher level. So the question is asking us whether subjectivity is unfairly condemned. I wonder if we can find some ways in which subjectivity should be celebrated in history. The question asks if it's overly celebrated in the arts. What's good about subjectivity in history?
But just to what you said earlier about there are some talks that goes on afterwards, like a university rather than a school. What did you mean by that?
I'm trying to pick up on Mr. Henrik's idea that there may be some things that are standard aspects of a curriculum which have been accepted for some time at a certain level, but maybe at another level are being debated and contested. In other words, the idea is some of the things that might be in a textbook could have been in textbooks for a long time, and they're actually starting to be revised. Haven't yet been revised enough and agreed upon by enough people to say, okay, we'll change the textbook, and so these things kind of remain.
It's a huge battle in this country because education comes under states' rights. So every state has a different idea of what American history is, and some lean towards sort of historical process and research and contemplating different narratives, and some leans towards a much more nationalistic, myopic view of U.S. history from a perspective of an American. But so it is a real contentious topic in this country, especially in legal circles in every state.
It is in England as well.
Is it?
The Conservatives always seem to push for a view of history which makes the British Empire look good, and others try to say, well, let's try and tell a more balanced story about the impacts of the British Empire. So that would be an example.
Well, so I think maybe, based on this metaphor, that the academic place where there is this subjectivity, where there is an acknowledgement of this is a vying and a battling for narratives, would be a place where we should be celebrating, because that's how we get history, right? Like, I think maybe it is almost at a point where in those circles they're being overly celebrated, right? The most powerful history books that are being released year after year are the radical redescriptions, right? You think you understand that humans, came to where we are because of the agricultural revolution. It turns out it was bears, right? And that's big for a year, and then the next year it wasn't the bears, it was the saber-tooths. And then, meanwhile, you have the day laborers just digging up the goods, doing that work. And then the sort of, again, more objective, even though the curriculum will definitely change from state to state, the role of the teacher sort of being to recite an official agreed upon history.
Exactly, but if you look at the role between an educator and a learner, whatever information the educator gives the learner, I feel like it's still, as learners, we still seek to evaluate that information with objectivity. And I think that that's what's expected as learners as well from educators. That the information that we gain, even though it's from a subjective point of view, we would still want to address it in the most truthful way possible.
That's fair. We are going to open up now to give an opportunity for the audience to either ask a question or make a point or comment about anything that you've heard. It could be a question about the PT or a comment about the discussion that we've had so far. So, over to you. Do you have any questions?
I sense a question brewing.
I mean, there is a point that I've thought of, and it also has a question, but I didn't know really well how to state it. And it's about subjectivity into the big personalities of history. So, for example, into ranking how powerful or who was the best emperor or general from France. I think that in that case, it's much more of a subjective choice. But if it's an individual choice against a group choice, then the individual is more driven by objectivity and cannot really choose subjectively. For example, if comparing Napoleon Bonaparte and de Gaulle, I mean, de Gaulle was mainly at the end of the Second World War and is the one who went through the end with the French revolutionaries and everything. But Napoleon won more battles. So depending on your point of view, maybe Second World War was more important than all the battles, or maybe all the battles were more important than the Second World War. But if then you are confronted to a group of people that agree on one point that is more objective, seen by also professionals and experts, then I think that objectivity is much more rational and subjectivity is condemned and is not really accepted in that situation in history.
I agree that is a fair point. Just wanted to point out Napoleon was not an emperor, he was a general. And
I'm not a history person. So.
I just had to say it. And in my opinion, it was Louis XIV. That was the best.
Okay.
I think
So
that we
that's
can
subjectivity.
think about this, take this to my unfortunately limited American context. A big point of battle every year amongst historians is the ranking of US presidents. This is a place of much, let's say, ink. Well, no, ink is no longer being spilled. Laptops are unfortunately being left on. Arguing about this for hours and hours at a time, and I think what you're pointing out, again, goes to this notion of there is an objectivity even amongst the subjectivity. If you come forward into these places and you go, just so you know, the best president in American history was Andrew Johnson, you will not have a single historian who agrees with you. Right? It's just almost indisputably false. Right? And so there is, even amongst these spaces of pretty radical subjectivity, I mean, George Washington is often considered the most important president of all time. Lincoln is normally number two. There's a battle back and forth between those two. But you couldn't put a Johnson as a number one. You couldn't put a Woodrow Wilson even as a number one. Calvin Coolidge, like there's an understanding that even amongst subjectivity, that objectivity has a place.
That's interesting because I was going to say that Pico's example is about as subjective as it comes when it comes to history, because it's just value judgments. And you're saying that even there, you run up against the expert opinion with their criteria or whatever they might be, that they're trying to make that more objective. I wonder if anyone would like to comment on the idea, or does anyone have any thoughts about how history has become more diverse, and the importance of listening to different voices. We've talked a little in class about the idea of history being often very Eurocentric, for a number of reasons. We looked at kind of Anglo-centric and Eurocentric stories and narratives and how that's being reshaped today. I wonder if the question, by saying it's unfairly condemned in history, might point us towards that, saying we need to get some new perspectives in rather than trying to find a truth. Anyone like to comment on?
And I think it is progressing. I definitely think that history is now open to more interpretations, because many things that happen in the world, especially currently, it is affected nationwide. Because there are many diverse groups in many countries. It's not back in the days where certain race, certain nationalities stayed in their countries. Now it's like we're all in different places. So even though, exactly, like, yeah. So say now that there's a war in one location, many of other places will receive the same, not the same, but they'll receive to an amount of consequences, because there are people that are from that nation that are protesting in a different location. So if I want to talk about Israel and Palestine at the moment, with what's going on in Gaza, there are many Palestinian protests worldwide.
In that sense, you're talking about how not just information being globalized, but the importance of a particular event has become.
Well, information is spreading because the impact per nation is spreading. That's why when we look in the past, it was Eurocentric. I don't think it wasn't by choice. It was because most of the global implications that happened was because the wars in Europe, the conflicts in Europe spread, while smaller battles that were fought in Southeast Asia, for example, it didn't affect much. It only affected between perhaps two nations.
I think also the spread of information is also very important to take into account. So, for example, in this situation with Palestine and Israel, it only recently hit the news of Western media. But as someone who's lived in the UAE, we've known about this ongoing war for quite a while. So I think it's also, because that's like obviously something that affects that nation more. So obviously there's a lot of bias, not only in the news, but in the history and the message that's being spread around.
Yeah.
I have a
I was just going to see if there are any more questions from the audience, any more points.
Can I make a controversial take? This is a last thing. So the uniformity of the stories being told in the past and the lack of perspectives was obviously ethically deeply wrong, and the limiting of experiences and ways of seeing the world and telling history was deeply wrong. The concern that I'm seeing for history is the destabilization of the narrative being splintered and fragmented. Now, certainly the white Eurocentric straight narrative was incredibly damaging, but it was a narrative, right? I think any group of people can come forward and supplant that narrative. I think that we could maybe get to a place of diversity where we reform a single narrative, but I think that we're not considering the consequences of fragmentation, I guess, when answering this question. I think that if we're going to answer unfairly condemning history, we have to grapple with the reality of sort of today. Now, we can't excuse or get rid of the history, right? Like, I'm thinking in an abstract sort of theoretical way. If we could create a diverse yet still harmonious, coherent history, that would be obviously the ideal. But the concern that I have is that in the destruction of this admittedly ethically wrong and messed up sort of coherent history during this fragmentation process, how we get back to a coherent history that also is ethically considerate of how diverse the viewpoints in the world are, different perspectives and histories. It's sort of, yeah, this concern, and whether it's something that we would like to get back to, I think is his own sort of question.
This fragmentation, so for you, then the potential drawback of subjectivity is that we might not have a clear narrative at all.
Yeah, and that again, make sure that everyone back home, I'm not saying that the narrative as it was right or good at all. It's just the idea of having a coherent narrative that's gone, and whether we're gonna be able to reclaim one while preserving a diversity of voices, or if inherently there are gonna be these sort of waves of rebuild. I mean, this is the reason why we have these arguments in the United States, right? A lot of people are uncomfortable with the notion of like, well, there's 5 or 6 different perspectives on it, and we need to have one, we gotta choose our one.
Well, I think we have, I'm sorry to cut people off, but we have reached our time. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming, for sharing your ideas and perspectives. We may not have covered every aspect of the question, but I think we were able to dig around quite a lot into the PT. And I hope that you get a lot out of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you guys.
Let's look at the current situation, if we're gonna follow this.
Annika.
Cool. Yeah, it'll be on there.
You guys have like such complicated words, like I couldn't.
No,